Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things of what used to be known as the global war on terror and what we now call the Long War. Today, I have two guests, two friends of mine, Jonathan Schanzer. He's a senior vice president for research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And also Sinan Sidi. He's a senior fellow also at FDD, an associate professor of national security studies at the Marine Corps University, and an expert on Turkish domestic politics, as well as Turkish foreign policy. John, Sinan, welcome to Generation Jihad. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Bill.
Hey, thanks, Bill.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. And today, of course, with Sinan and John, we are going to talk Turkey. Turkey has played an interesting role in the war on terror, as well as U.S. relations in the Middle East and with Europe, and also some interesting happenings with the events in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're going to focus mostly on the Middle East and terrorism today, actually exclusively on that today. But there has been a continuing, deterioration of relations between the United States and Turkey. It's occurred on multiple levels. I would argue that it began during at the onset of Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, when Turkey refused the access to allow U.S. troops to invade northern Iraq from Turkish soil. It's been all downhill from there, but particularly since President Erdogan was elected, I think things have really the relations have slid from there. But Sinan, let's talk a little bit about the history there. Where do you perceive things to really have slipped in the relations between the U.S. and Turkey?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. I think the history that you draw does make sense. I think the onset of the 2003 invasion of Iraq really did sort of see a diversion of interest between Turkey and the United States. In hindsight, it was probably a good idea that the Turks refused or just said no to U.S. troops, because that would have likely resulted in Turkish troops piling into northern Iraq and getting into a severe conflict with our Kurdish partners, which would have been even bloodier. And we sort of kind of dodged that bullet. But I think that really did sort of put a fly in the ointment and sort of bitter sort of increase animosities between the two states. I remember General McChrystal writing a horrific sort of biography, and the Joint Chiefs were not very happy with Turkey at the time. But really, in recent memory, I think the wheels in the relationship really did come off with the Syrian civil war, and that's really sort of seen a divergence of policy choices and preferences by the Turks, mainly because we have relied and justifiably relied on the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, to undermine and eradicate the remnants and the body of the Islamic State, whereas the Turks prioritized the toppling of President Assad and really did sort of engage with what I would call, or what many have called, sort of radical jihadist entities in Syria to undermine Assad's regime. But what we should remember here is, I think the biggest problem is the Turks in their relationship to topple Assad have worked with entities like Jabhat al-Nusra, any sort of al-Qaeda remnants or affiliates in the area, to pursue this sort of what I call very unstrategic goal, with no end and no purpose in sight other than to topple Assad. And this has resulted in the Turkish homeland becoming a sort of highway for sort of radical extremists transiting Turkey. There have been numerous reports over the years that suggested and sort of likely indicated that the Turks were providing assistance to jihadi elements in the form of weapons transfers, logistical support, medical support. This has abated slightly under U.S. pressure, mainly with the opening of Incirlik Air Base to coalition aircraft to bomb ISIS targets. But today, there are numerous entities inside of Turkey and persons that continue to sort of provide this sort of support. Recently, the U.S. government under the Biden administration has started to increase pressure on Turkey to sort of stop bankrolling things like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, right? but also disrupt Islamic State financial networks. And the Turks have kind of reciprocated in designating entities and sanctioning them. But what I would call these basic scraps, right? A few individuals here and there, a few companies here and there have been sort of slapped with US sanctions. Whilst this has been welcomed by Washington, and it should, I think this is not even the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that could be done to sanction and really disrupt terrorist financial flows if the Turks chose to do so. And the only reason why the Turks have done this, as far as I can tell, is President Erdogan is up against an election. The Turkish economy is in the doldrums. Subsequent to the election, Turkey is going to need a lot of material and economic support, not from the West. And I think Erdogan's sort of facetiously trying to buy some sort of credit in the event that he wins. I don't think Washington is sort of buying it to the full extent, but they seem to take whatever they can get and humor Erdogan until the elections pass. We'll see.
Yeah, I get a very distinct Pakistan vibe from all of this, where the Pakistanis cooperated with the United States, where it was willing to against groups like Al Qaeda and the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan and other terrorist groups, but didn't budge when its interests really aligned. But I think there's another issue here, and I suspect you and I disagree on this one. Probably, maybe not suspect isn't the right word, and that's the U.S. support, the creation of the Syrian Democratic Forces. I think this really the support of this, because my opinion or my analysis of this, and look, I've seen these groups, they're wearing the patch of the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It's the Syrian branch of the PKK. And I think this issue really helped drive a wedge between the United States and, it all stemmed from the Syrian civil war. We can discuss whether it was a good idea, but my position was, if you're going to use the Kurdistan Workers' Party from the U.S. perspective to fight the Islamic State, and understanding there's no good allies in northern Syria to work with, they should at least been taken off the designation list. But I'm just curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the main problem that the Turks have really underscored with multiple U.S. administrations, from Obama to Trump to now Biden, by our insistence on relying on the SDF. And that's true. I mean, the SDF has made no pretense of its sort of organizational links to Turkey's PKK. With one big difference, I would put there: the SDF, or the Syrian Kurds, or the PYD under the leadership of Salih Muslim, has never made any threats against Turkey. I think they've been preoccupied with two major problems and as goals. One is not to be slaughtered and killed by the Assad regime, and also to defend their turf against roving hordes of ISIS fighters. I listened to General Votel yesterday, who was in charge of establishing and steering this relationship, and he was very adamant that without the SDF, we would be nowhere in terms of undermining the Islamic State forces. I'm also on the record for suggesting that Turkey's sort of animosity towards the SDF and the Syrian Kurdish sort of fighters is not really a strategic or a security problem, as they sort of bang on about for the last 5, 6, whatever number of years now. Right? I think this is largely manufactured. And I say that because, in addition to the Syrian Kurds not overtly or indirectly threatening Turkey in any shape or form, they've actually said, look, we've had negotiations before. You invited Salih Muslim to Ankara, rolled out the red carpet for him. His son has died fighting ISIS. What are your concerns? And we'll address them, right? The Turks have never been interested. Erdogan's always used the Syrian Kurdish issue to sort of grease his base voters of a sort of threat that there's going to be hordes of Kurdish invaders coming across from Syria and terrorizing Turkey, which is simply not true. But I think, to your point, I think if the US was really going to sort of seamlessly execute the fight against the Islamic State by relying on the SDF, they should have, as you said, taken the SDF off the designation list. But I think that would have caused its own problem. Yeah, it would have caused all sorts of other problems. And
with Turkey, that would have increased problems with Turkey too. I really think that the U.S. jumped in to work with the SDF without working to.
That's true.
The Turks on board here, and this is, again, I get it. There needed to be some type of, and I don't know how this can be done. And you're correct, and that the maybe Erdogan was never going to accept them as a partner in the fight against ISIS because of political reasons. But we do have to admit that we have to recognize that this is a reason for the bigger scale, the deteriorating relations between the U.S. and Turkey.
Let me just add a very small point and then be quiet for a second. I think it's also a recognition that there were no good scenarios of how to basically tackle the ISIS sort of threat. Sometimes there just is no good answer, and no administration had any appetite to deploy several 100,000 U.S. troops into Syria with no goal in sight based on our experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. So anyway.
Yeah, no, listen, I always describe Syria as the Game of Thrones with no Starks. It's just, who are we going to partner with there? There was just no good allies. I get why they did what they did with the SDF, and John, I'd like your opinion on this, partnering with a group that's on the U.S. foreign terrorist organization list. And yes, I know people make distinctions between the Syrian PKK and the Turkish PKK. But, I just find that to be, given what we do in this business, I think our word means something. I think that it devalues the list of especially designated global terrorists and foreign terrorist organizations. So I'm curious what you think about that, John.
Yeah, look, I don't think the U.S. did itself any favors in aligning with an organization that is clearly part of that PKK structure. But I do think it's worth just framing this just maybe a tad differently, because there is kind of a chicken and egg question that I think we need to deal with here, right? I think starting 2011, which was the beginning of the Arab Spring, it was really before the crack up of Syria, before the general kind of chaos that we saw as the result of the ISIS problem. Turkey had already decided to pivot in a decidedly anti-US, anti-West, pro-terror direction. And what I mean by that is it had already become a hub for the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas, for example. It was already helping Iran evade sanctions, right? This is beginning in 2012 through 2015, while this problem is sort of evolving. You've got the Iranians helping to move $20 billion in cash and gold on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran at the height of the effort to impose sanctions on the regime for its nuclear mendacity. You've got a decision on the part of the Erdogan government to open its borders almost without even a check that would allow a range of bad actors, including ISIS, I think primarily ISIS for that matter, to flood into Syria so they could bring down the Assad regime. And I remember actually talking to a senior U.S. official. I'll leave their name out of this right now, but the person was in Washington, and I asked just bluntly, hey, you were just in Turkey, you were dealing with Turkish authorities. What is your sense of their strategy? And the response was that the Turks had decided that they are going to use ISIS in order to bring down the Assad regime, and then they could roll back ISIS whenever it was convenient for them, as if that's even possible, right? So what we can see kind of writ large is that this government under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, I'm loath to say the Turks writ large, because I do believe that most of these decisions rest on the shoulders of one man, but this one man has decided to play with fire in multiple arenas. And yeah, sure, the guy has every right to be upset about our partner, but this is a partner that we enlisted because of a problem that he helped create in Syria, right? So how angry can he be that he helped foment and exacerbate the ISIS problem? Then we decide we don't want to get in there and get our hands dirty because the American public is sick of a bunch of, jihad wars, right? We have fatigue from all of that. So we find a partner that's willing to do it on our behalf, that we get to stay at arm's length from all of that. And then he's angry that we're working with them after he created the problem, right? This is the sort of logic that we are constantly wrestling with, or lack of logic that we constantly wrestle with in the Middle East. And so I have to say, by the way, and that doesn't even include, right? These are just a couple of examples. Erdogan he's acquired the S-400 from Russia, further sticking a finger in the eye of the United States. That's a big no-no. There have been human rights violations out the wazoo, a backsliding of democracy and freedom and human rights inside of Turkey. The sheer number of bad actors that this guy has worked with over the years, he's just, he's in a glass house here. If he's angry at us about the SDF, okay, well, maybe look in the mirror a little bit about the kinds of actors that he's been working with. And I think you just need to step back and look at that horizon, and it's been a disaster.
Yeah, no, I could not agree with you more. I think that's very well said, John. My concern is getting in bed with a foreign terrorist organization to fight another foreign terrorist organization. I think regardless of what he's done, I still think we have principles and the law to uphold. That's but, just really.
But getting back to you said Pakistan. I mean, think about it. We enlisted the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. In the 80s. Right, working with a terrorist organization to go. Well,
they weren't designated. They weren't listed as a foreign terrorist organization.
Okay, that's splitting hairs. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with a bunch of very bad guys back then.
Dealing with bad actors and dealing with someone who's on that foreign terrorist organization list is, to me, that's a red line in my book. Right? What good is having that registry, having that list, if we're not going to adhere to it ourselves? That's really.
I might also add with the notion of the PKK, and I have no problem of classifying it as a terrorist organization, and it's done some horrendous things in Turkey. But I would just highlight, until 2007, the Turks essentially, tried to shut down and really deny any possibility of establishing a fruitful relationship with the KRG in northern Iraq. Simply because they've historically just been ambivalent towards the Barzanis and the Talibani entities, saying that they're material supporters of the PKK and that the PKK has bases in northern Iraq, which it did. But somehow and suddenly, after a round of negotiations, the Turkish government, under Erdogan, I might add, found a way to accommodate and reach a compromise and establish a meaningful, and I might say very fruitful relationship with the KRG. My point being that if it was serious about having security concerns about the Syrian Kurds, they could have essentially squared those probably with Saleh Muslim, right, and really probably got it to sort of lay down its sail. But it chose not to do that, and that's my bottom line on it. Simply because they've rather used that as material, saying the United States is working with terrorists, i.e., the SDF, to solve a terrorism problem. That's good material inside of Turkey for his voters, but I don't think he seriously advocates or believes that the SDF is a representative of a serious terrorist threat against Turkey. I've never believed that, and the actions of the SDF have shown that. But I agree with John. I mean, everything that they've done, Turkey's foreign minister, Ahmet Davutoglu at the time, and Turkey's national intelligence chief, they released a leaked document and a recording suggesting that if what it took to get the United States involved in a bloody campaign to topple the Assad regime was going to be a bunch of missiles, right, launched into Turkey, right, that they could manufacture, then so be it. They would be willing to do this because they wanted to pull the United States into a hot war to topple the Assad regime. And Davutoglu and Hakan Fidan, the Turkish intelligence chief, are on record for saying this. We never push back against that. It's like saying, how, you really are playing with fire here.
I have no illusions about Erdogan's, what he's doing. My concern is on our end, the perceptions on our end, how serious we take these. Again, we should have pulled the PKK off the list if we wanted to work with them to fight with ISIS. That's just, I'll just leave it at that. We have an upcoming election. It's very soon. We're recording. This will probably be released several days before the election. He's sliding in the polls. Talk to us, Sinan, about what is happening here. Why is Erdogan sliding in the polls? I also read, and I think this was you wrote about this, that he wants to, assuming he's going to win, and I'm going to assume he's going to fix the election to get what he wants, that he wants to reset relations with the United States post-election. Talk a little bit about this, about the about his vulnerabilities inside of Turkey right now.
Well, he's at his most vulnerable politically. We've never seen him against the rails this much in his 21 years of governing the country. All right. Right. So he is sliding the polls. It does look like the opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, has a narrow lead over him that some have described as being within the margin of error. Some not. Some say the opposition leader has much more of a potential to topple him in the election. At this point, I think this is like a soccer match. Nobody knows, right? We'll have to wait until Sunday, because there's just no verifiable data that will let us come down one side or another. The potential to undermine the election by sort of chicanery and undemocratic means to stay in power is a real threat. It maintains that that sort of danger is there, but we'll just have to see. But Erdogan does appear to be sort of setting himself up to remain in power. And he has made some moves to essentially sort of buy some sort of goodwill, or what I've called a possible and attempted reset with the West. What does that mean? Well, it's part of his larger sort of attempt to sort of break out of his diplomatic and regional and global sort of isolation, right? Erdogan has broken basically every meaningful relationship that Turkey has ever had as a state, starting, I would argue, with, the European Union back in the early 2000s, but then swiftly moving on to Israel by basically just torpedoing that relationship, just ripping it apart at the seams. But also with the Arab world around it too. I mean, Turkey's sort of broken its relationship with countries like Egypt, not to mention sort of the UAE, but also just every sort of regional power that's of consequence and that is of interest to Turkey, the United States, and the Western Hemisphere in general. And throughout 2022, he's made like massive U-turns and tried to reestablish sort of, reset ties with these countries. The diplomatic, ambassadorial level relationship has been restored with Israel. He stopped calling Sisi a dictator and wants to shake his hand. He's tried to sort of, bring the Saudis on board. But it's been sort of very conspicuous in the sense that whilst these regional overtures have been made, nothing towards the West as was sort of in the offing. And he now realizes that if following the election, regardless of who wins, JP Morgan has predicted that the Turkish lira will slide against the dollar by an anticipated 50%. The country's foreign reserves are basically in the central bank in the negative, right? They have, and you have this huge public account deficit. So he's going to need some money. The Turkish state is going to need a huge injection of cash. And the only meaningful source of that is Western creditor institutions, probably the IMF at this point. Somewhere to the tune of, I've been told, 150, 200, even $250 billion of a standby agreement might be necessary for Turkey to be just bailed out and stabilized economically, right? He's not going to get that by basically continuing to insult the United States, maintain the S-400s, antagonize, Western partners and allies in the Mediterranean, Greece and Cyprus, threaten to go to war and target U.S. troops in Syria, right? He's going to have to lower his sails one way or another. And some of these sort of, sanctioning of radical entities in Turkey has been an outreach of that. There has been some rumor suggesting that he may finally proceed with divesting Turkey of the S-400s by selling them to India. Who knows? I'll believe that when I see it. But he wants to turn some sort of page with the US. Will that happen? I don't know. I don't think he's sincere. He can turn on a dime, but I think he wants to put the feelers out there, saying, at the very least, let's establish a baseline of cordiality. And if I make some moves on your long shopping list of grievances, what am I going to get in return? Right.
All right. I'm Bill Roggio. This is Generation Jihad. And today we're joined by Jonathan Schanzer. He is a senior He's a senior vice president for research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Sinan City, he's a senior fellow at FDD as well as associate professor of national security studies at Marine Corps University. And we're talking about Turkey. John, Sinan mentioned that, I think he aptly put it, Erdogan torpedoed the relationship between all of the regional allies as well as the United States. But what is his motivation for this? What was his motivation for turning on Israel? That relationship was solid for decades, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. It seemed very strange at the time. I have my own theories, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, it makes actually very little sense in when you begin to assess that the Turks enjoy actually a very fruitful economic relationship with Israel. There's a huge number of services and products that are exchanged, and then on top of that, there's the countless number of Israelis that traverse the Istanbul International Airport, which is a Middle East hub. And then actually also thinking back to the 1990s when there was really close coordination between the Turkish army and the Israeli army, and that it benefited everyone. The Israelis were buying Turkish water back when they weren't desalinating their own. It was a really warm and fruitful relationship. Then you have Erdogan come in. He's Islamist, and there was a time where people talked about him as a possible moderate because he wore a suit, as if that means anything. But hey, he's an Islamist with a suit, so therefore he must be better than the mullahs of Iran or what have you.
This is that desire for moderates, John.
Where you talk yourself into right. You start
moderate Islamists.
Right. Yeah, that's a thing. At any rate, we begin to see a steady backslide on the part of Turkey after Erdogan came in. And I'd say that for the first, 7-8 years, Sinan, you probably agree, it was by small measure, a degree here, a degree there of deterioration. In my view, it really all began to unravel 2010, 2011, right? 2010 was if you recall, that was the flotilla incident, where the Turks, fully embrace Hamas and try to break Israel's naval blockade of the Gaza Strip. Then you have the outbreak of the Arab Spring, as it's called, where the Muslim Brotherhood is surging in Middle East states all around the region, and Erdogan goes all in. It's basically Turkey and Qatar that become the greatest champions of Muslim Brotherhood movements that seek to gain power around the region. And so you see Turkish activity in places like Egypt, but also in places like Libya, certainly in Syria. It was a strategy, by the way, blessed to a certain extent by the Obama administration, to do more outreach, to have more influence with potential Islamist governments. And it was something that alienated the Israelis. It alienated the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians. I mean, there are actually very few governments right now that are left in the Middle East that don't have a sour taste in their mouth from the Turkish and Qatari intervention during this time. And then again, you got to remember that they're backers of ISIS. They're supporters of the Islamic Republic and helping them evade sanctions. The Hamas support, right? It's just the last decade or so we've watched the wheels come off the bus of Turkish security policies in the region, diplomatic policies in the region, and it has alienated and by the way, we know that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, these are not perfect governments, but they are, let's just say, more pragmatic. They attempt to work within the confines of U.S. direction and U.S. policy. The Turks just were not even in the same ballpark. They really went way off the path. And, I think there's a question now whether it's even possible. And this is something that I know that Sinan has looked at in some depth. There's a question of whether Turkey can even be steered back to within the sort of, the guardrails of what was once considered a somewhat pro-America policy.
Yeah, you read my mind. You asked the question that I wanted to see it on that last point. Is this recoverable? Do you think this is recoverable?
Just before I touch on that, I'll just highlight something that that John and yourselves touch on. I mean, one on the fundamental underlying reason that people have never gotten about Erdogan, and there were a lot of sort of cute Democrats, as in not American, just advocates of democracy and democratization, right, that always sort of portrayed Erdogan as this sort of fuzzy, cuddly reformer back in the early 2000s. And if you sort of took any position against that, then you were sort of labeled as a fascist, essentially, the Turkish
or Islamophobe, right?
Right, and I say that, but my main sort of counterpoint, and because people have been asking since he tore apart the relationship with Israel, in particularly, right, saying what changed with Erdogan. And I'm like, well, that essentially is your problem for asking that question. Nothing's changed. The guy was socialized in Turkey's most broad-sweeping political Islamist movement, right? I mean, if you look at his sort of indoctrination and just rearing and raising as a political entity, I mean, he really was raised in Turkey's worst anti-systemic movement. Grievances against the West with Turkey's relationship with NATO, the secular state, its Western aspirations, its European aspirations. The guy is on record historically. You can watch multiple YouTube videos of him in the 1980s and 1990s declaring what he really is. So when people look at the sort of relationship that Turkey had with Israel, that was both economic, but it was also military, intelligence, diplomatic. I mean, Turkey sourced all of its tank upgrades from Israel in the early 2000s, all of its F-16 upgrades to a huge extent possible. Intelligence sharing, joint training between the two militaries, the relationship between Turkey and Israel, it wasn't just economic, it was so multifaceted and so lucrative, but also beyond just material aspects. They had broadly saw eye to eye on regional security issues, which made it a very powerful relationship above and beyond economics. In some sense, a relationship that Turkey never was able to establish with the United States, right? We don't have an economic component. We don't have a people-to-people component. And the reason why he destroyed that is because he's anti-Semitic. I mean, that's the bottom line. This is Erdogan through and through. He hates Israel, and he is a through and through hater of the Jewish people. And so nothing changed. This was Erdogan at his core, right? And that
can I just say, actually, just to interrupt, Sinan, what's interesting is I think you're right. I think there are deep anti-Semitic sort of elements to Erdogan's worldview. And then I think that drives certainly his support for Hamas and that Islamist sort of flavor that we get from him. But what's so interesting is that in recent months, we've seen on the part of Turkey an effort to engage in some sort of rapprochement with the Israelis. And what's so interesting about that, I think that also smacks of anti-Semitism. In other words, his attempts to get back into the good graces of Israel, he believes in his heart of hearts that this is the way to get back into the good graces of the United States. And so that idea of kind of Jewish power, outreach to Jewish Americans that might advocate for him, right? That is like, kind of the essence, right? That he believes that somehow Jews control power in Washington, and therefore he needs to appeal to them in order to get back into the good graces of Washington. And there is something deeply wrong and disturbing about that worldview. And I think it just needs to be said that, nothing has changed about this guy, even as he has tried to, let's say, steer things back to better ties with Israel and better ties with the United States. The way that he's done it, the mindset that he's had, I think, should really raise some red flags.
Yeah, it's completely disingenuous. And you're right. I mean, they've been on a sort of a walkabout in throughout Washington in the last 12 months. Various government operatives of Turkey basically going around, organizations, the government, think tanks, just to sort of see if they can really sort of entice the Jewish American sort of network to sort of back Turkey in Congress so that Congress can remove its objections to issue waivers so that Turkey can buy new military equipment from the United States. I just that disingenuous approach shows, well, it also shows that, they have no idea how things work here. And that's sad. But, the Israelis and any other power that Turkey sort of annoyed or like burned in the last 10 years, they're happy to sort of have a Turkey that they can talk with, as opposed to sort of exchange and hurl insults with. But let's be honest. I mean, the Israelis are not idiots. They're not fools. They see right through Erdogan. It's a very sort of cautious sort of relationship they're maintaining. But to your question, Bill, is this recoverable? Yeah, it's a really hard question. So there are some optimists who believe that if Erdogan departs in next week from power and Kılıçdaroğlu takes power, the optimists believe that it's a couple of years that they can basically circle the wagons, economic development can get back on track, reinstitutionalization of the country, governance by rule of law, empowering the bureaucracy as opposed to one-man decision-making can basically make things go away. I'd love for that to be the case, but then I also want a unicorn, and that's not how the world works. I mean, look, Erdogan's vitriol and sort of hyper-nationalist, hyper-Islamist, authoritarian narrative is so deeply entrenched in the minds of a lot of Turks, in the sense that an entire generation has been born and grown up who is 21 years old or thereabouts, who've only been subjected to Erdogan's vitriol, right? And their worldview and the way they look at the world has been sort of like pumped full of pro-Erdogan media, pro-Erdogan public discourse that has really just poisoned the mindset of an entire country for a long, long while. Against that is a very sort of, emboldened opposition and a populace that's, civil society organizations, university students, but also secular elites and people who just think this can go away. But it needs time. It needs time that this man needs to be removed, and his vestiges of abuse of power and rule of law need to be made an example of. They need to be prosecuted. They need to be shown that what they did was inexcusable and punishable under law, and they need to go to jail, right? Unless people see this sort of stuff, then we're basically going to whitewash this and condone that what they did over the last 20 years was acceptable. And we don't, the Turks shouldn't give that message. Is it recoverable? I think only in time. Some things you can, like if Turkey, was to be steer the country back onto economic orthodoxy, sure, you can see the benefits of that within 12 months, to 24 months. The Greek economy was recovered by a lot of intervention, but a lot of austerity and prudence, which was painful, but they steered back. It's what you do with the social fabric of the country, which I think is, you can't just knock things down and expect them to be rebuilt in the shadow of Ataturk and the secular sort of non-Islamist state that the country was essentially built as. It's going to take time. And for that, we need a reinstitutionalization of the country, which is governed by, consensus. It's governed by, a broad decentralization of power, such that it's not just the playground of one authoritarian brute.
His removal from power certainly has to be the first step.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, without that, nothing happens.
Yeah, exactly. And John, you had made an excellent point, and I wasn't aware of this, that the administration was actually encouraging Erdogan to pursue this policy. That's incredible.
You have to look back at the Obama era. It's truly remarkable. I mean, there was a time where Erdogan and Obama were speaking more than I think Obama spoke to any other leader. And this was kind of at the height of the Arab Spring, as he's essentially proposing that the Brotherhood is a legitimate actor, one that could potentially bring stability to the region. And that relationship endured for, I want to say, probably 2 years. I think it all came to a crashing halt. Sinan, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it all kind of came to a crashing halt after protests came to Turkey, right? After Erdogan's out there supporting all kinds of protests against other governments, then protests come to Turkey. It's that famous Gezi Park protest, at which point he cracks down with utter brutality. And he looks just like a lot of these other brutal Arab countries that he's been trying to overthrow. And it's at that point that I think the Obama administration says, yeah, maybe we made a mistake here. Maybe we were backing the wrong horse. And so they back away from him. But for, I want to say, a good 2 or 3 years, this was a bromance between Erdogan and Obama. And it really, really bothered the likes of the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Egyptians. This did not sit well with kind of the royalist camp, the pragmatic Arab states. They really chafed at this. And I got to say, they weren't wrong. Not that any of them are angels here, but they, I think ultimately they have been preserving the U.S.-led order in the region, and they saw the dangers of Erdogan's plan to supplant many of these states with Islamist governments.
It's amazing, that lesson wasn't learned. That, how we encourage the deteriorating relationship throughout the Middle East, or the deterioration of key relationships throughout the Middle East. And then I'm going to go, of course, because I can't avoid Afghanistan when I have these discussions. And yet we continued to search for moderate Islamists within the Taliban, right? The lesson should have been learned from Turkey, from the Arab Spring, which really was the Arab winter, that they weren't there. And but yet we pursued, even a decade after that failure should have been recognized, we can continue to try to find moderates within Islamists. It's always backfired on us. Sure, you could find, go ahead, Sina.
I was just going to say, Obama talks about this. He sort of regrets this in his biography and dedicates about 4 or 5 pages to just how his tongue was burned. Not that it really changes anything. But you would have, with all lessons learned, we covered this at FTD just a few weeks ago, right? Even now, the Turks launched a drone attack recently into northern Iraq and almost killed not only the leader of the SDF, Mazlum Abdi, right, but also the strike could have also killed senior U.S. servicemen that was riding along with him, right? And the Pentagon's response has been tepid, basically saying, we're not sure who did this. But I was like, what will it take? Is it going to take the assassination of a 1-star U.S. general for us to finally understand that we should not be humoring this guy, right? That he is, simply problematic. And I think and the one problem that sort of hamstrings them is this sweetener that Turkey puts on that Erdogan puts on what he does, which is, if you burn me, and if you just cut ties, and if you really learn your lessons, then I might just really stop cooperating in any meaningful sense in places like Ukraine, and even all the half-assed measures that I do against, containing the Russians. And I think that's what's really sort of keeping things like the Biden administration, but even the Trump administration, to sort of continue to work with Turkey, right? Because it's just seen as a sweetener enough. So that's just should be bear that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. We never seem to want to hold individuals like him to account. Turkey and counterterrorism. In my opinion, Turkey's been hot and cold on this issue, and mostly cold. Turkey's relationships with groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the successor to Jabhat al-Nusra, the Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda linked group. Obviously, there's some, distance put between the two groups, but still is not a good actor. John, back in 2014, you identified this problem of Turkey's willingness to work with terrorist groups. You wrote a paper called Bordering on Terrorism. I'm sorry. And you've been attacked by the Turks for your analysis. They've made some pretty interesting accusations against you publicly. Can you talk about this a little, John? I've always found this. You wrote an article about this 5 years ago. Frankly, it still makes me laugh, makes me question you a little bit. I got to admit, maybe the Turks have gotten in my head. But tell us what the Turks have done to you, what they've said about you, just for having the temerity to identify what they were doing when playing footsies with terrorist organizations.
Sure. Look, just to recap, though, I mean, we've, as an organization dedicated to, let's just say, wise counterterrorism policies, and broader, kind of pro-American policy in the Middle East and beyond. We called out Turkey's involvement with Hamas. We called out Turkey's involvement with ISIS. We called out Turkey's involvement with the Islamic Republic and its smuggling scheme, that $20 billion smuggling scheme. And we were involved actually in a Department of Justice case against the primary actors involved in that scheme. We've called out the Turks on S-400. Even some of its leanings towards China, the flirtation with the Shanghai Cooperation Council, the human rights problems. I mean, there's been a litany of challenges. And so when you get out in front of that in a town that typically is friendly to Turkey, right? I mean, DC is kind of geared toward the preservation of Turkey as a NATO ally. They have kind of protection from the military, I think, primarily because of the Incirlik Air Base, which is crucial to, or has been crucial to, American operations, and is even reported to house nuclear weapons there, right, to deter the Russians. And so here you have this actor that's gone wild, and you've got this relatively small think tank hammering them, and so they fire back. Right. This is a government that has not appreciated the criticism that we've leveled. And so it actually, first it starts with accusations that we were part of the coup plot against the Erdogan government back in 2016. From there, as the story about Gas for Gold grows and arrests are made, and
so you're not a member of a sex cult. That's true.
That you're aware of, yeah.
Okay.
But
right, okay.
Yeah,
oh, John,
right. That I will admit to, yeah. But
how about the? Are you a friend of a cult leader? And,
well, this is the cult,
you
right?
Shared state leaders with state secrets with you.
Yeah, this guy, his name's Adnan Oktar. He was arrested, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. Crazy guy that had like a news channel with these incredibly tall, attractive women. And apparently after every news broadcast, they'd go back and do whatever sex cults do. I was in touch with one of the anchors via Twitter, I don't know, 10 years ago, and they found that out and decided to paint me with the same brush.
It all goes back to Twitter. Yes.
It really, that it is the cesspool of humanity. But at any rate, there was the accusations of being a coup plotter, being a sex cult member, being an agent of the Mossad, being an agent of the CIA, and just overall, I found my name in the Turkish media more times than I care to admit. Never, ever in a positive light. I've actually been told not to travel through the airport in Istanbul, that I could be pulled aside for questioning. That's something that I typically don't want to do. So, I stayed away. But we continue to think that it's important to shed a light on Turkey's problematic policies, regardless of how they respond to us. And it's, getting back to, kind of the original question of elections. This is one of the reasons why these elections are so important right now, is that for the last, 20 years, Turkey has been under the iron grip of Erdogan. This sort of thing, the attacking of, an American NGO or even individual Americans like myself, had become far too normal. We've even seen Turkish thugs beating up protesters outside of a think tank in Washington some years ago, right? I mean, they are taking liberties that they really should not be taking, and putting the relationship with the United States at risk. So these elections are indeed very consequential, and we've got to hope that this could be a turning point for Ankara.
Sinan, have you experienced the same level of vitriol from the Turkish government? Another of our colleagues, Akyan Erdemir, was a fellow at FDD and one of our good friends. Boy, he's really taken it just as bad, if not worse, than John. Have you experienced this type of attacks from the Turkish government and the pro-Erdogan press?
So what John and Aykan have experienced, I think, are somewhat unique in the sense that I have never seen the government go after the likes of John or Aykan with any other sort of critic. In Aykan's case, they've really sort of rolled out the red carpet by basically confiscating his personal property inside of Turkey, which is just egregious. and a gratuitous, I would say, breach of the law. And at every instance, we basically highlighted this simply because ICANN and throughout his work has been so instructive of all the misdoings of the government of Turkey. And what John has experienced and what links them together is basically, this is what happens if you cross the line. It's a campaign of delegitimization, dehumanization, and basically just trying to go after and intimidate sort of dissidents and critics. Not just by doing it to John and ICANN, but serving as more like a banner, a warning to other would-be critics, right? Saying, we'll come after you like we come after these if you cross the line with us. I'm glad that we're not intimidated by this. And for my part, I all I can say is, they've called me a member of being a Gulenist, et cetera, and I've kind of laughed this off because when I was a critic of the Islamists earlier on, whether it was the Erdogan government or even its predecessors in the 1990s, I was accused of being an Islamophobe. Now they're accusing me of being a Gulen member. I'm like, well, which is it? You got to have some sort of consistency here. That's about as worse as I've gotten, but nowhere in the sort of ballpark of what John and I have experienced. And so, yes, I'm lucky so far.
Yeah, well, that's good news. Yeah, this is a tough business. For those who aren't aware, when you put your name out there publicly, you're open for attacks like this from individuals and from government. I've had numerous threats from Islamists, including one or two based here in the United States. Thankfully, Shabab killed one of them for me. Not normally do I nod my hat to a terrorist organization, but thanks, guys. And also from states. The Long War Journal has been banned in Pakistan for over 12 years. I've been told not to travel there, and I've been called. This is always makes me laugh. An agent of the CIA, of Mossad, of India's Research and Analyst Wing, as well as the Taliban when I was creating the map of the Taliban controlled and contested districts in Afghanistan,
that's amazing, Will.
As well as the ISI. So that's quite a range of groups there, and I'm just still waiting for that first paycheck. So if you're out there, if you guys are listening, give me a ring. I'll get you my address. But until then, I'm a free agent. Sinan, there's been a very interesting development as we were talking about the elections. Tell us what's going on. It looks like a candidate has dropped out.
Right. So the Turkish election right now is beginning to sort of look like increasing like a Brazilian soap opera with huge climaxes and unexpected developments at the 11th hour, just before Turks in the mainland are about to go to the polls on Sunday. So what has happened is the third party candidate, who was the man by the name of Muharrem İnce, who was the main opposition's presidential candidate against Erdogan in 2018 and lost miserably, right, has just pulled out of the race. And he's basically pulling out. Now, it's kind of important simply because right now there were 4 candidates in Turkey running for president, right? And there were 2 sort of, what we call third party candidates, or a third party and a fourth party candidate, who were thought to be splitting the vote, which meant that, in the first round of balloting, no candidate, either Erdogan or Kılıçdaroğlu, was going to get over the 50% threshold, likely triggering a second round of voting. Now that Mr. İnce has pulled out at the very final minute, eyebrows have gone up, suggesting now could Erdogan lose in the first round, given the optimism, given the sort of momentum being experienced by the main opposition candidate, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu's campaign? The answer again is we don't know, but this can't be coming as welcome news to the Erdogan camp, simply because, again, this is a huge momentum shift in the final hours of the race. I'll be on record saying I don't know if it makes any difference to the final outcome. It's hard to say what will happen, but the last credible poll that I consider came out today, suggesting, without this information, without this recent development, that Mr. Erdogan could still lose in the first round, given sort of the momentum that the opposition has picked up in the last week of the campaign. So we'll have to see. But it is a last-minute development, so we'll watch this space.
Sinan, John, thank you very much for joining Generation Jihad today. A fascinating conversation about Turkey and the complex landscape there. And thanks, everyone, for listening, for joining us to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.